Hi, my name is Juliana Daniels, and I welcome you to my screencast on a book chapter by Tyson Pegg and Len Ramney, captioned Introduction, Ludology, Narratology, and the Teaching of Literary Games. As a literary scholar and an educationist, I have always sought ways of integrating innovative technologies into literary pedagogy to make the teaching and learning of literature more engaging and attractive. This vision is in view of the continuously dwindling number of students pursuing literary studies in higher education in Ghana. I find this publication very interesting because it explores the integration of game studies into the literature classroom and presents arguments for the use of games to enhance literary engagement and critical thinking. The chapter also examines the interdisciplinary approach of combining ludology, which is the study of games, and narratology, which is the study of narratives. In addition, it highlights examples of games used to teach literary concepts, as well as giving us a historical overview of how games have developed and how they have been integrated into education over time. Now, going through the chapter, I realized from the beginning that there's the argument that literature is a game. And the argument is based on the fact that, according to the chapter, literature has a recreational component. The recreational nature of the form and the playful engagements between authors and readers compared to how players engage with games. In this case, the literary material is the game and the reader is the player. Now, structurally, poetry, fiction, and other literary forms are presented as bearing the requisite elements of a game, such as rules, strategies, and players. Literary materials have rules in their design and composition. There are rules governing how to read them and how to make meaning out of them. There are strategies for deducing meaning out of literary materials, and like players in games, readers must also know these strategies and techniques for reading literary materials and making the most meaning out of them. Now, the authors also argue that literature's ludic qualities involve the tedious binary of win and loss, which is central to many game forms and functions. They also argue that literature is a game because, regardless of the debate between narratologists and ludologists, humanities can be seen from many angles in terms of play versus work and seriousness versus entertainment. So, whereas literature has its components of entertainment and seriousness as an educated, games also have the component of entertainment and seriousness as an given didactic impact. They also think that literature as a game can be seen in terms of the constituent parts and of literature, in terms of characters, language, diction, certain themes, subject matter, plot, etc. All these are possibilities that are found as constituents of games and constituents of literature at the same time. And that is the key reason why these authors think that literature can be synonymous to game and vice versa. Another part of the article indicates that both games and literature make use of ludic themes from literary realm and literary history. They cite examples from the riddles of the Sphinx in Oedipus Rex, the tale-telling game of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and they also cite example of sports novels and non-fiction such as Bernard Malamott's The Natural, Don DeLillo's End Zone, and detective fiction that they think can be construed as games. Now, talking about detective fiction as games brings to mind Ebenezer Crouch's game cast that was about detective themes such as fraud, crime, and cybersecurity exploration in the game he chose for his gameplay exercise. Now, in this article, Edgar Allan Poe's Murder in the Rue Morgue is cited as an example of detective games that have literary components and can be equated or can be seen as synonymous to literary forms. It is also noticed that the authors forward the argument that games are literary and literature as a game in the sense that they look at the design protocols of both literature and games. They try to compare the two. For instance, they talk about the fact that sonnets, villanelles, rondels all have metric rules and specifications that must not be flouted. For instance, for a poem to be called a sonnet, it has to be in 14 lines. And depending on the kind of sonnets that one wants to write, whether Shakespearean, Spenser, Petrarchan, whichever, the number of quatrains, the number of octaves, sextets, the number of couplets are all determined and are fixed. Therefore, if anybody wanted to write a sonnet, the person must decide on what kind of sonnet and then follow the rules of structure for that sonnet. According to these writers, a similar thing happens with game design. There are rules concerning game designs. There are rules in terms of the information given to the computer. There are rules in terms of the number of characters that can be engaged, the nature of characters, the mobility of characters, and how rules concerning how a game can be won must be adhered both by the game designer and the player. So, in looking at the protocols of form and structure in terms of literature and games, the authors argue that both have strict rules that accompany their formation and then their usage. And so games can be equated to literature and literature to games. Reading this article, I appreciate that games have been around for a long time and literary studies has been around for as long as man was created, I guess. And so when this article posits that there's a long literary history of pursuing the intersection of literature and games. It is not surprising that Johann Huizinga is mentioned when his work titled Homo Ludens, a study of play elements in culture, play, poetry as social game, is mentioned here. And there's also the mention of the 1968 Yale studies on games that talk about how games can be equated to social activity. Here we see examples drawn from Jacques Eman, Michael Bourgeot, A.J. Greenman, Michael Holkhurst, and Michael Bakhtin. All of these people who wrote contributions to that 1968 Yale French Studies on games and gamification. Now, these scholars forever remain in history as important contributors to academic discussions relating literature and games. So, as far back as 1968, we realized from this article that efforts had been put in place to try to bring to the fore the synergy between games and then literary studies. Now, this historical revelation continues in the text when the text begins to talk about studies of literary games being subdivided into games that focus primarily on literary pieces that focus primarily on games, such as Jenny Adams' Power Play, the literature of politics of chess, which politics of chess in the late Middle Ages. This is an old publication that examined literature and how it is crafted as a chess game. Then we also have literature that primarily focus on authors such as Kathleen Blake, who writes on play, game, and sport, with focus on literary works of Louis Carroll. And then we also have a third group of literary games that focus on the ludic and literary strategies. And example of Peter Hutchinson's games authors play is mentioned, and we can say from the text that there's the argument that irrespective of these game forms or literary forms that exhibit gamification, there's the need to approach looking at literature and games from a careful line of threading. Otherwise, we may impose an overarching structure on a phenomenon that is predicated on rich interconnections. Literature as a phenomenon and game as a phenomenon have their own individual interconnections that kind of hook them together. If we are not careful, according to this article, we may try to disintegrate one from the other, and in the process, we may lose the very rich constituents that make these individual units come together seamlessly for effectiveness. So that's one of the major arguments raised in this article. Now, even though the journey of um, games and its relationship with literature started, as we have just noticed, as far back as 1968 or earlier, we are told that a writer like Bruce never imagined that there's going to be an explosion of games and the birth of game studies at all as a field of humanistic endeavor. The reason being that when Atari's Pong was released in 1972, there's the argument that it did not catch a lot of attention from literary critics. At the time, games as a cultural phenomenon was virtually impossible to imagine, but gradually it became rather impossible to ignore as things began to change. The historical trace of the change is pegged at the 1970s and the 1980s, where the middle class children grew up with rudimentary game consoles in their households, and then perhaps subsequent decades that witnessed the establishment of game studies as serious scholarly fields. And even more recently, as recent as the 1990s, when we had the establishment of the International Board Game Studies Association, IBGSA, and perhaps later in 2003 when we had the Digital Games Research Association emerging. Now, these developments finally drew attention to the fact that games have come to stay and their impact on literary studies must be given the attention. Even in 2018, we are told in this publication that Entertainment Software Association reported that video game sales had climbed up to about $43.4 billion. And that was a huge impact or contribution to world's cultural economy. And since that achievement, the authors argue that we can just not ignore games and their effect, games and their contribution to education, to economy, to literary studies. And so theirs is the argument that games are here to stay, and we cannot help but appreciate how they influence our understanding of preceding cultural forms, including literature. Now, the article also draws our attention to the fact that regardless of all the achievements that we have enlisted gained by games, there have been a few hitches. There have been people who have fed on controversies generated by the intersection of cultural forms in games and literature. The argument is that storytelling and video games are not entirely the same. And this kind of complication, according to the article, has led to a lot of controversies because those who proponents of these arguments are trying to separate gameplay from narrative. This notion or this movement of separation has generated a lot of arguments. Those who are against the separation argue that most games have storylines, just like narratives, therefore literature. And even though in the beginning, the earliest graphical arcade games that emerged, like Pong, incorporated one or two player competitions and scoring, they did not have overt storylines. And so it is not necessary that all games must have storylines. The writers think that even though not all games have storylines, most games that have attracted a lot of players, have made a mark, have storylines. For the argument on games and storyline, I think that truly not all games have storyline. I look at Mario and I wonder what a storyline really is. It's just movement and trying to avoid um, falling into a deep and all that. There's no clear storyline for Mario. That's okay, but the text also um, mentions Space Invaders that emerged in 1978, and they think that Space Invaders is fully encapsulated in its title as that just the storyline is evident in the title. So there are people who go to space and try to take over. Another mention is made of Asteroids, a game that came out in 1979, and Missile Command 1980. In all these games, these authors argue that they have very minimal narratives. The games were just about shoot and destroy. However, they go on to argue that there are some games that emerged earlier that really had a kind of close relationship with literature, and the way um, they directly linked they were directly linked to literary culture. An example is Atari's breakout game called Adventure that emerged in 1979. They argue that Adventure alludes to Beowulf. Beowulf is an oral narrative of Old English history. And they think that Adventure was based on Beowulf because it has one of the key characters in Beowulf, the dragon called Grendel. The incorporation of the story of Beowulf, the storyline of Beowulf, in the view of these authors, is a reminiscence of Arthurian quests of the Holy Grail. So there is an effort to take what we call historical literature and convert it, take the storyline or the plot line of a historical literature, as in Beowulf, and then manipulate it into a game version titled Adventure. And this is giving us an example of how games merge with literary culture. All these historical changes are exciting to know because it gives an idea of a tracing of development from simple board games to text based games to electronic games. And now in the text, we are told that video game production has moved along with time and has also developed with the development of technology. Now it seems, according to the text, we have the opportunity to have heavily embedded computational graphics. In the video that we watched 2 weeks ago on the game, we saw how game pixels continuously developed into virtually clean images with high pixels that are very close to reality, with good picture quality, good ambience, good lighting, and good general game display. Now, just as the development of graphics has moved on with technology, it also the development of storylines has also come along, and users and game developers have continuously stretched to make the most of the rapid improvements of video games and video cards and video forms of entertainment by merging narrative development and then the development of graphics. And that is very, very, very interesting because, as a literary scholar who is also interested in literary pedagogy, I want to, I'm interested in how game designers can use game development to teach the elements of literature. And this article is very insightful on how it traces the history of game development vis-a-vis the elements or nature of literature. For most movements, it's always the argument of who started what and when. And it must be noted that in the case of games and literature, whilst game studies scholars think that the real beginning of game studies started with Chris Crawford's The Art of Computer Games and Computer Design in 1984. As for those in literary narrative circles, the literary narrative scholars, they think that Janet Murray's Hamlet on the holodeck, The Future of Narrative in Cyberspace, published in 1997, marks the pivotal beginning of studies in literary narrative and literary narratology. Well, in both cases, both ranges of scholars, there's a recognition of the power of games, and both of them claim that they have equal status. Literature, they think that just as literature and movies have equal status, sooner or later, literature and games will have the same status. There's the argument as part of the publication that when film emerged, it had issues or conflicts with literature, with one trying to claim supremacy over the other. This is the same thing happening with literature and games, and they are hopeful that one day, just as now, film and videos are now integral parts of literature, or have equal standing with literature, games will also come to have similar standing with literature after definitely a long argument. Now, the authors argue further that Janet saw early text based narrative games as a new form of writing and storytelling, and has always said that there's a huge potential of expanding this new genre of narrative games. Two main people emerged to cement the argument of the potential of games and literature. One of them is Espen Asset, and then the other is Murray. Now, Espen Asset published Cybertext Perspectives on Ergodic Literature. This is a book that took seriously the field of video game studies and electronic literature. Once they are talking about cybertext, it has something to do with technology and literature. And then we also have a text by Murray, who recognized the role of storytelling in games. He was an advocate for the aesthetic and narrative potential of video games and cybertext. The major difference, according to the text, between Murray and Asset, even though they both focused on electronic or technology infused literary games, Murray looked at storytelling in games, whilst Asset focused on the essential differences between games and cybertext. Whichever way, these two, according to the text, are historically noted for their contribution to the expansion of studies in literary forms and gamification. So, in the submission of the historical overview of game and literary development, is the presentation of the usual contestation that happens in any human society, where a new ideology competes with an existing ideology. In this case, games coming to meet literature seem to contest with each other for space and for recognition. And so this image here, created by Ian Burgess, playfully depicts a clash between Janet Murray, who represents narratology, and Espen Asset, who represents ludology. So it looks like the two are in some form of fist contest, where Murray seemed to be the old guard asking, "Hey, you, who are you? You want to fight me? You want to displace me?" And perhaps it's interesting to note that as part of the historical submission, the article admits that those who try to argue that games have nothing to do with literature didn't seem to last long. They were kind of shut down, and their submissions were outrightly rejected. To the extent that Later on, a debate identified one of the entities as being subsumed by the other or being equated with the other. In this case, the entities were games versus literature, Ludo versus narratives. And in the view of Sovic Mukherjee, eventually something will have to happen. One must give way to the other. One will be equated to the other. So far, I think that the wrestling is still on. But surprisingly, the article indicates that there's a new genre that is a measure of the two phenomena. And that genre is titled ludonarratology. The authors aver that ludonarratology is a new critical field that has more distinct discussions related to the intersection of game and literature as a result of the subtle shifts for dominance and the subtle shifts for equation in relation to games and then cultural forms. Now, Tyson Park, who is one of the authors of this chapter, explains that ludonarratology and uniting narrative theory with gaming theory appreciates the various ways by which forms are currently shifting in light of their increasing intersection, while also retrospectively enhancing our own understanding of what narratives are and what ludic forms are, what both of them have been in the past and what both of them are now developing into. Now, with this submission, it is obvious that we can define ludonarratology as primarily an effort to realize that both games and literature have mutual and fruitful overlap in the sense of where games give a further enlightenment to text, and text give further enlightenment to games. So the publishers think that ludonarratology has come to make a claim, and it comes in as a key intervention in both literary and then game studies, as much as it comes in to kind of quell the tension that these two phenomena has been breeding over time in terms of supremacy or emergence. Now, in both cases of ludonarratology, the proponents of this emerging form argue that there's a general question about narrative form, character, plot, or theme. And in a class where ludonarratology is implemented, learners are required to generate examples from a wide range of cultural artifacts to depict how these artifacts have played a role in video games, and to argue that these artifacts found in video games actually come out of literature, theater, poetry, television, and film. And so, ludonarratology is an emerging field of study that seems to focus on finding the relevant connections between games and literature, with the effort of making the argument that indeed games have a place in literary studies, and literary studies could be effectively carried out through the implementation or inculcation of integration of games in the literary classroom. Now, with the introduction of this new genre, ludonarratology, the article moves on to talk about work and play vis-a-vis game and narratives, drawing from Tom Sawyer, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain, where Tom contemplates on what he's doing as play, with the argument that what you call work is subjective. It is how you see what you do that determines whether it is play or it is work. In this case, whether you call a submission game or literature depends on the individual's inherent or preconceived qualities about what is being done. Now, the argument of ludonarratology is that gamification is central to effective narrative studies. It advocates that gamification will surely point out muddying of the differences between work and play, with the aim of achieving the objectives of fiction, of literature. That is to say, if we inculcate games into literary studies where there are challenges, games can come in and then smoothen the rough edges. In the end, the objectives of the lesson can be effectively achieved. Thus, we have, according to the text, proponents of gamification talking about the need to endorse the virtue of cloaking work under the guise of play. That is to say that even though in teaching literature it is serious work, it is important that work is made attractive, work is made exciting through play. In that case, we can use gamification to lighten the burden of education. Here, literary studies. Therefore, they argue that games will enhance one's success in various aspects of life. In this specific case, in the study of literature, if we allow it. Now, they also cite Jane McNoligal, who says that the great challenge in our time, that is today, for the remainder of the century, is to integrate games more closely into our everyday lives and to embrace them as a platform for collaborating on our most important planetary efforts. This means that there's still some path to chart when it comes to gamification, that is inculcating games into literary studies. And the article further suggests that if it is possible for us to incentivize people as players through luderic structures, that is using game structures, then we have to go for it and build enough games that kids will love and love learning. If it means that gamification will improve literary studies, then nothing should stop us from going ahead to develop good games that learners will love and will make them love learning literature. Now, there's also the argument that if gamification or the integration of games is good for literary studies, then it is worth considering the benefits of work-play dichotomy as efforts to increase the achievement of our objectives. And that is why this article further indicates that when we take a good look at the many programs that we call video games in our era today, most of them are beginning to resemble what they call work. That is to say, most of them are moving away from mere fun entertainment into educative or purposeful games. And so they talk about literary theorists and philosophers who think that gamification is beginning to be an avenue for enacting what they refer to as the Nietzschean lust for power and the Derridian idea of constrained play. This argument of games focusing on the show of force, the show of power, it's one of the concerns of many educationists. And so to see it here in this article is very interesting. It means that even though gamification is still good for the literature classroom, there is that element where the literary theorists and philosophers drum home on the need for game designers to begin to look at the concern for literary theorists. Perhaps looking at what this article is saying is for us to be careful not to make games now look like too serious for education, and education not looking like too playful. I remember when I tried to give my son a game to play. It was an educational game with very little educational luster. And in the first 1 or 2 minutes, it was like, this is too boring. That is the argument that this article is raising, that games, in an effort to integrate games in the literary classroom, we shouldn't turn the entertaining aspects of games into too much serious educational work. Neither should we turn the educational aspect of games into all play. There should be some balance. That is what they call for. so that players can embrace games for their manifold pleasures, whereas people in various other circumstances, usually children and students and workers, can be lured into gamified experiences precisely because the gameless versions of these activities traditionally require work. So if we want to attract people, students to still do some work without feeling labored, gamification, according to this publication, is the way out. We can use games to reduce the laboring effect of work, and it will pay off. Therefore, they further argue that there's the need to interject or the need to dissuade people from arguing against gamification in literature classroom, but we should rather promote the purposeful and meaningful deployment of games in the literature classroom. If the literature indicates that gradually learners are shying away from literary studies because they are finding reading of text monotonous and boring, then according to this text, gamification is the way out to reduce the laborious nature of text reading and textual analysis in the literature classroom. Their basic argument is that gamification extols the potential of games to facilitate learning. And they strongly believe that inclusion in the pedagogical realm is a way of making games more useful and making the teaching and learning more effective. Hence, there's the need to promote games in school curriculum with the objective of helping students to assimilate and retain their lessons. That's this idea of gamification is what, and in the view of the authors, Carmen Kosovo refers to as work play. And by work play, Carmen is talking about creative organizational culture as part of the educational process to promote and enhance learning. Well, I believe that there's a genuine case for gamification in the literature classroom, and I agree with the authors when they say that instructors of literature and classroom work must appreciate that classrooms are not places of inconvenience and drudgery, but of aesthetic pleasure and delight. And gamification as one of the means of achieving this in the literature classroom. There's the advocacy that when used well, gamification can assist instructors in sharing this pleasure, and a wide range of students will benefit from it. Gamification, according to the text, can be used as a pedagogical strategy in the sense that gamifying the literature classroom should be done objectively with a steady eye to the benefits and the liabilities. Talking about liabilities means that according to the article, when it is done well, when game integration is done well, it can enhance students' participation in the classroom and increase their enthusiasm for analytical and evaluative exercises. However, we are cautioned that gamification is not a panacea for a dull, listless class. Rather, it can be used as an appropriate strategy, among many others, for engaging students within the literary realm. So if the class is dull and listless, you can use gamification, but you should also look out for other factors that are impeding the learners enjoying their lessons. Now, this is a chapter of a book, and we are told that the book has 4 units in this volume. One of the units talks about theories of the ludic and the literary classroom. We have another talking about video games and interactive media in the literature classroom. Then there's another unit talking about gaming identity and ideology in the literature classroom. And the 4th one looking at gamifying the literature classroom. I think that all these topics are very relevant, and with time I should be able to go through all 4 of them to really deduce the import of how they explain gamifying the literature classroom. Now, so far, this is what the text is about. I think that this is a very interesting article. It's an article that is also an eye-opener. It is a refreshing article that talks about video games, oral traditions, and the coverage of literature in the classroom. It's an article that talks about promoting gamification and literary studies, finding the synergies between the two and making the most out of the two. It's a wonderful piece that is worth reading and worth engaging with, and I am happy that I did come across this text. I hope that I've convinced you to also read it and find some meaning out of it. I leave you with the core message of the text of the publication, and that is that there's the need to advocate for the potential of gamification to make literature studies more engaging and relevant, especially for students familiar with gaming culture. We see this article recounting the historical interplay between games and literature, from riddles and ancient stories to video games and modern narratives. As part of this historical traceal study, this article also presents games as serious cultural artifacts alongside literature, and encourages instructors to think about a deeper appreciation of storytelling forms through games. The chapter also addresses the forever ongoing debate in academia between ludologists and narratologists, in as much as this tension between who is who and who subsumes who and who's at par with who. The writers advocate a balanced approach that will ultimately enable educationists to find purpose for gamification as a strategy to increase classroom engagement while remaining cautious about the limitations and demerits of gamification. They do not shy away from emphasizing that gamification has a tendency of reducing the work value of literary studies, and that's being overshadowed by the entertaining aspects of games. Therefore, they call on educationists to be very cautious in gamifying their literature classrooms to ensure a healthy balance that maintains focus on critical thinking and analytical skill development amongst learners in the literature classroom. On this note, I end my screencast, and I'm grateful that you spent all the time with me. See you another time on another cast and on another insightful article. Thank you for being with me. Bye.